when you take what's called a macrodose of a compound like psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, LSD, these kind of things, you're going to have a very altered state of experience.
Each one of us has a story. It's being written in moments of both joy and pain, in life's triumphs and its tragedies. It holds the power to inspire, to deliver hope, to bring change, but only if we will use the power of a voice.
I always say everybody has a story. I think you have a bunch of stories. So let's start from the beginning. You were born in?
Technically England. I was there for about 2 weeks. So my parents, who had met in Papua New Guinea, through their own work and their life travels, they came over to England for the birth, for the hospital system, which was a good decision in retrospect because I was breech with the umbilical cord around my neck and needed an emergency C-section, which couldn't have been successful in the Papua New Guinean health system. So that was a fortunate decision. And in Cornwall, England, I spent my first 2 weeks, and then the next 4 years in Papua New Guinea.
And then?
So at 4, my father's work took us to Portugal, and we settled there and had 5 or 6 years of my sort of childhood upbringing in Portugal. Mm-hmm. Beautiful memories, such an incredible place. And interestingly, it was a wonderful place to live then, and then it sort of took a decline over the next couple of decades. My father stayed there, even though I left when I was 9. Oh. But now Portugal's becoming this mecca, total hub of innovation and education and health systems and things like that. But I left when I was 9. My parents had broken up, and my mum actually kidnapped me in the middle of the night with my will.
The stories, okay, yeah.
Yeah, it was something I was on board with, but very much at the age of 9, sort of influenced by her stories and her perspective, and I decided to remove myself from a relationship with my father, which was interesting. We've now reconnected, I'm happy to say, but moved at 19 to Scotland, which is where my mother's family lineage had come from. And so I started high school in the same school that my grandfather and great-uncle had been in Edinburgh, had very, very beautiful 8 or 9 years in Edinburgh, which is really where I consider my formative years to have been. I consider myself Scottish. I wore a kilt at my wedding earlier this year, and we were there until 18. So a bit of backstory is that my mum was brought up and born in Kenya. I'm a fifth-generation Kenyan. And so when I graduated high school at 18, she decided she wanted to return to her motherland. And so we moved on to an elephant sanctuary there.
Wow.
Spent a beautiful year or 2 in Kenya, and I would keep going back. I actually still have a home there because my mum passed away when I was 19. There was a burglary in our house, and she was attacked by 4 men who sort of broke various jaw bones and things like that, and she ended up in hospital and suffered from a medical procedural difficulty. I had been on my gap year, so it was the first time I had really flown my wings, and moved to Canada, spent time in Scotland and in Portugal, and I heard that she had this attack, and I flew back. It was really beautiful because after having 3 months away from her, which was, she and I were like
buddies.
Peanut butter and jelly. We were just such, I think I really grew into the role of both a son as a teenager as well as almost being her partner, her sort of life partner through those years. So it was the single thing that I always imagined as a teenager that couldn't happen. I felt I could probably be resilient enough to bounce back from anything else, but not my mother passing away. And so when that happened, first she was attacked, I flew back there, and we had one night together, which was the most bonding evening I had ever had with her. She sort of saw me as this peer, an actual adult who had grown into the that next chapter of life. And I got to hear about her living her life in sort of a very, I'd say, free and contented headspace. And I found out the next day. I took her to hospital, went back to the house, and then the morning after I got a call that she had passed away overnight. And this beautiful moment was actually sitting on the top of the rocks at the sort of in front of the balcony in my home. And I mentioned earlier it was on an elephant sanctuary, but the natural pattern of the elephants would be that they would walk up at sunrise, walk through the garden, drink from the pool, and then around 7 a.m. they would make their way. And this was the only time in all the years that I've had that house where they came up, about 15 of them as a family came up at sunset when I was sitting on the rocks crying, and they were just mourning several feet underneath my feet. And they could feel it. They could feel what was going on, which gives me a lot of respect for the animal kingdom. So I had to sort of process that, and my family processed it in different ways. But for me, it was a blessing because I saw her as being at her prime. You know, she was 57 or 58 years old and very much felt accomplished. She had lived a beautiful life. She had seen myself and my sister sort of, as I said, start to spread our wings and enter into our adulthood. And then being a single white woman in Kenya trying to build a business without many resources, without a lot of friends there, I felt strong woman, but I think life would have gotten much more difficult for her. And it almost seemed like she passed at her apex, which I was able to process in a pretty short time, relatively speaking.
And what did she say to you that sticks with you?
For her, life was about the yes and the trust that everything will be okay. The more risks you're willing to take and the more self-confidence or sort of self-empowerment that you grant to yourself. And it wasn't necessarily one thing she said, but it was all the things she said over
a lifetime.
Over a lifetime. And she certainly lived by example in that regard. And so I've really carried that forward. It's been part of my philosophy in life. So that was that life chapter. I had a wonderful move then into my first real romantic relationship. No psychiatrist needed to guess at why my first long-term partner was 8 years older than me.
Oh,
and
wow.
Definitely filled a bit of a role of that maternal figure.
Oh, that's sweet, though.
It was beautiful. Yeah. Still so grateful to Stacey, who was my first partner back in the UK. I went to architecture school in Cambridge, and that was where I really started to recognize the sort of the role I had to play in my own sovereignty in my career. It was really interesting being in an academic institution with that many centuries of history. And, for example, the education I got in architecture was called phenomenology. So I had a tutor, an 87-year-old Czech philosopher who saw architecture as something very different than what I think most of the world uses as the paradigm for buildings and master plans. And most of our society sees architecture as something to look at, whereas he taught me about how it was something to experience, something that you move through, and based on the way sound reverberates around a room or a space, the way the tactility of the walls and the carpet changes your senses, the way that you then communicate with people or
he was
process
way
thoughts.
ahead of his time.
Very much so.
And when you worked with him, did you think, I'm going to draw a building, or I'm going to draw a map of the mind?
That started to emerge.
Yeah.
It's a very insightful question. That was really what started to emerge once I moved to New York. I was working on the Ground Zero project with Daniel Libeskind, who's one of the most famous architects. So that was an honor at a young age to be working with this major sort of hero figure in the space. And in New York, I got to meet some of the brilliant minds, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the people who are pushing as Steve Jobs would say, pushing against the inside of the balloon and seeing how far you can stretch that fabric of reality around you. And that was when I started to realize that through buildings, I might be able to impact a few thousand people, but through technology, well-designed tech experiences, what we call user experience, I might be able to impact millions of people. And what that's now evolved into is impacting how millions of people think and how they process both challenging as well as positive emotions and social interconnectedness.
When you were in New York, were you intrigued by the reaction about the people?
I was intrigued by everything about sociology. And again, architecture does teach more than how to design a building. It's an education in history and phenomenology and theology, as well as sociology and
A lot of
anthropology. Yeah. I mean, really, and then environment and sustainability and physics and so forth. So it's this incredible, all-encompassing type of education, which I still recommend to people who don't have one clear thing they want to do. For me, it was when I was 13 and I told one of my mum's partners that I wanted to design cars, because what 13-year-old boy doesn't want to design cars? And he sat me down and he said, if you want to be a designer, I recommend you look at architecture. And it was really from that age onwards that I started to gear my high school education and various sort of decisions towards architecture.
You had a focus.
In a way, yeah. A focus with a diffuse awareness, I would say.
What's that word?
Well, diffuse awareness is this concept that, and I guess it traces back to evolutionary theory, that the masculine, and this is not always men, as you know, but generally the male of our species was evolved to have tunnel vision, to be able to focus on things that are far away for hunting purposes, whereas the female, which we could now call the feminine, developed a peripheral vision or diffuse awareness, because they would be hunting, they would be gathering, or picking for vegetables, or making fires and cooking and washing and things like that, and they would need to be aware of predators that might be coming out of the bushes. And so generally, and this doesn't apply to everyone for sure, but generally evolutionary theory has that sort of separation. And I think one of the gifts I got from my parents was being able to kind of vacillate between both. And so having a drive.
That is a talent.
Yeah, and one that I didn't necessarily consciously derive, but I am very fortunate to have recognized that about myself, and then through that, cultivating it even more and sort of practicing that, the switching between the two. You
go from New York to?
Then I was in New York for 8 years, and so first as an architect, then as an experience and event creator. I was creating, at the age of 23 or 24, I was creating conferences for sort of C-levels and major business figures.
How did you get into that?
Because I wanted to.
I just did it, right?
I've been fascinated by not just psychology, but something called behavioral economics. Is it a term you're familiar with? Behavioral economics is the study of the psychology of how people relate to both financial decisions as well as sort of economic decisions at large. And that ranges from the economy of the world to transactions between people, like a negotiation, that type of thing. So there's a lot of psychological study into why we make certain decisions that actually are quite irrational in many ways, and they come down to things called biases. So our mind has these biases that inform how we make our decisions that are essentially driven by the autonomic nervous system. And that's the sort of flight or fight response that we all have, that reptilian brain that it's sometimes called, versus the prefrontal cortex, the default mode network, which is responsible for logic, rationale-driven decisions. And that's not actually how we make most of our decisions, it turns out. So I became interested in this, and I thought this could be relevant to the business community. And so I held these conferences for incredible. We had the CMO of Walmart, for example. People on that level come to these conferences, and there's my business partner and me, sort of dressed up in a fancy suit, trying to be 10 years older than we were. And it was beautiful in New York, we'd have a psychologist from Yale or from various other Ivy League and other universities come to basically teach.
So how many
C-levels.
years ago was that?
This would have been about 10, 11 years ago.
So 10, 11 years ago, did people really think that way? Like there is a psychology behind everything we do?
Some people, not everyone. And it was part of my mission at the time to help more people understand that because it's psychology, it's philosophy, it's ontology. There are all these, again, ologies that
thank you.
drive what we do, and that's in a blind spot for most of us. Still, to me, even as somebody who's dedicated my career to it, I only know a fraction of what's out there for us to discover. And so this led me to about 2014. I got wind, and my partner and I, business partner and I, got wind of what was happening in Colorado here. And Colorado was roughly one of the first 3 states to legalize recreational cannabis use. It was on the heels of California and a couple of other states that had legalized medical use in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then by 2014, enough research was starting to show the medical benefits of cannabis use for people without a medical prescription, as well as the cost of incarceration and how many people had been put into prison for many years, divorced from their families and from their careers and their hopes and dreams for nonviolent possession of cannabis. And if I could share a little of the history of this, I think it's an important puzzle piece that will relate to the work I'm doing now in psychedelics. So in the late 30s, there was an initial prohibition in the US, and this was very driven by anti-Mexican politics. Then in 1971, Nixon instantiated the Substance Control Act, and this implemented a prohibition as well as illegalization of the possession of cannabis and various other what are now called narcotics. And it turns out from one of Nixon's advisors coming to the press and essentially being a whistleblower many years later that there was documentation in the White House proving irrevocably that Nixon had, with his advisors, put this act in place as a very, very intentional way to disrupt the African American, or at the time Black communities, as well as the Mexican and other sort of non-American communities, as well as the hippie revolution of the 1960s. What did these groups have in common? They, for the most part, were anti-Vietnam War. And so these were the communities of people that were speaking up. They were avoiding the call to duty. And the Nixon administration saw they couldn't put people in prison for not going to war, but they could put people in prison and disrupt their leaders and their communities for possession of a drug that they commonly used. And so this is where cannabis prohibition really came into effect in the early 70s.
Your wealth of knowledge. Okay, keep going.
It's a scary part of our history, and then it was continued by Reagan, who in roughly 86 instituted
not shared with the public.
Not shared at the time with the public. And what happened then in the late 80s was that cocaine and crack cocaine started to be prohibited. And interestingly, the incarceration sentence of 5 years is applied for somebody who's in possession of 5 grams of cocaine, but 500 grams equivalency of crack cocaine. Why? Because crack cocaine is more commonly used by African American communities.
Wow.
And so I'm very actually pleased with the timing of this, because yesterday Biden announced that he's having his administration pardon the 6,500 people who are currently incarcerated due to nonviolent cannabis possession.
Politics or something else?
Politics, yeah. And politics and research, and I think more vocal proponents of fact-driven policymaking as opposed to propaganda and policy making for political sake.
So you and your partner come to Colorado?
Not quite. I came to Colorado. We had been friends for 1 or 2 years at the time, 2 or 3 years at the time, and we had been in New York. Both of us had gone through a divorce with our previous partners around that same time, and that was why I moved to Colorado. I didn't any longer need to be in New York with my ex-partner, and so the time came to focus on this business, which was my last company, Baker Technologies. We were building technology for cannabis dispensaries and their customers, and it started as the first online ordering system, so the way that you would use Grubhub or DoorDash or Uber Eats to order food, it seemed obvious that the cannabis dispensaries that were legally providing these compounds, these medicines, if you will, should have a similar tool, but nothing like that existed. And so we created the first online ordering system with beautiful photography of each product and fact-driven information about what was included, what kind of percentages and potencies that each cannabis strain included. And that allowed people to order from their homes, which was important because before that, a mother with 2 kids waiting in the car would be waiting in line for 45 minutes at a dispensary, which is not an ideal customer service nor experience for her. You'd have an 80-year-old with, tumors up and down their spine, again, waiting for 45 minutes in line to try and get their weekly medicine to them. And we created this online ordering system to ease that issue.
An uphill battle?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the first problem is that dispensaries couldn't, and in many cases still can't, accept credit card transactions because of something called FDIC insurance. And so it was a cash business, which meant that the dispensaries could only receive cash, and that meant they could only pay us in cash. So as a above-board, totally legal technology company, we were having to receive payment in many cases with brown bags of cash, which doesn't look great to a bank that you're trying to tell we're a legitimate business.
Yeah.
And so that was one of many, many challenges. But we really dove in on the activist level, so both in Colorado as well as then other states. We actually grew the platform to something like 30 states across the country. We had over 50% of the dispensaries, which was 1,400 of them, using our platform over many years, and that gave us a real sort of awareness of all the different dynamics and levels of political evolution. Now, cannabis is sold legally in over 40 states to far more than half of the country. And so we were definitely a part of that evolution for the country.
But still cash. Still
cash.
The same problem.
Yeah. And that's sort of one of the many symptoms of the lack of transparency that's involved in drug trade. And that ranges from the sort of non-pharmaceutical medications to the illicit black market drugs. Mm-hmm. And I think that lack of transparency is actually one of the biggest reasons there's still such a problem. The war on drugs has technically been dismantled, but the funding for this type of it's prohibition, it's also stigmatization, it's propagandistic-led messaging. And part of that is because there hasn't been the architecture and the sort of systems level thinking to actually bring knowledge to the fore and have more transparency across the ecosystem. That's really where we're making the big difference.
Okay, tell me about making that big difference.
Yeah. In 2018, I was one of the campaign leads to help Denver become the first city to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms. So you're familiar with psilocybin?
No.
Okay, so psilocybin is the psychoactive compound that's in magic mushrooms. Magic mushrooms, which have been used for centuries, maybe millennia, by our species in civilizations and societies all around the world, and currently to this day have no known harmful effects. They certainly have no known lethal effect, but it's debatable. Most people would agree they don't have a known harmful effect beyond being used in cases where somebody has a history of psychosis in their family. And in rare cases, it can then re-trigger sort of some lasting psychological challenges. But generally safe, and especially when delivered in the right kind of facilities with the right trained professionals and this type of thing. I'll say very clearly that I'm not recommending that everyone listening goes out and tries mushrooms without the right kind of education and support systems. But with those things in place, it seems like the research has really now generated enough evidence.
Is that the missing link? So I'm a consumer with health concerns. I don't know anything about it. My doctor hasn't ever told me anything about it. Who's going to tell me about it? You. But
well, it's changing. So there was a book by Michael Pollan called How to Change Your Mind a few years ago, which was a major inflection point because Michael Pollan he's a middle-aged writer about food, and he's a New York Times, I think, bestseller, maybe columnist. He's got this incredible reputation amongst all generations and many different demographics in the country as being a credible thought leader, somebody who's fact-driven, researches his work before he writes and publishes it. And all of a sudden he wrote this book on psychedelics and how he discovered through his own sort of journey and inquiring into them and seeking out professional guidance so that he could try different psychedelics and then write about what he experienced. And despite his initial skepticism, he essentially reported that it was all positive, a few exceptions. And of course, I don't want to generalize or over-aggrandize psychedelics, but generally it was this sort of positive reporting. And so you would have, I don't want to specify a certain demographic, but you would have a person who wouldn't traditionally have even accepted a dinner conversation about psychedelics, much less try them, suddenly being interested. And that was one inflection point. And there have been many since then that have really started to shift public awareness and perception around these topics.
Okay, got a lot of questions. Is that magic mushroom the only mushroom that is legal in Colorado, or all mushrooms?
So Denver specifically was where we passed the bill in 2019. That was May of 2019. Was it May or November? I think May of 2019, we passed essentially decriminalization. So it meant that it was the lowest law enforcement priority for a police officer finding somebody either in possession of psychedelic mushrooms or growing them or under the influence of them to be arrested or to be penalized. And making it the lowest law enforcement priority is essentially like decriminalizing.
But any kind of mushroom?
There are 250 plus species. Yeah, so there's a lot, 250 plus species that are psilocybin containing, and this
what does
that
word actually mean? The psilocybin?
Psilocybin is, again, it's the psychoactive compound in mushrooms. And so while there are thousands of species of mushrooms, so far we know of about 250 that have this compound. And it's just, there are many other compounds in mushrooms. It's just one of them that happens to create a hallucinogenic effect on the brain, so altered state. And so those sort of images that people might conjure up of
the hippies,
distortions and colors being accentuated, sometimes sound, and often also a sense of connectedness to other people, or a sense that I'm not alone. I'm actually sort of in this interrelated web with other people, or with the universe, with the environment. There's a observation that people suddenly become more intimately aware of the environment, whether that's trees or sort of the way that our planet is operating as an organism. And some of that might sound quite hippy-dippy, it might sound quite ethereal. I'm always really aware of that, and I don't mean to speak on those terms for sure. I don't want to be...
But the layman, right, understands that.
I hope it's helpful language. And, what this can do is have somebody come out of what is often an ingrained pattern in much of our society, which is I'm alone, I've gone through trauma and pain, I don't have a way of relating to the world around me, I don't have a way of being helped, I'm helpless, and often that can generate both a sense of selfishness, and I don't mean that necessarily in a critical way, it's more like I'm here to survive, and how can I possibly care for other people if I'm just trying to survive? And that translates to feelings of anxiety and depression.
Wow.
And these things are actual neurological dysfunctions. So depression is neurological, psychological, it's physiological. It actually impacts the body in a measurable way. And so what's happening with the help of psychedelics, I'd love to speak to a little bit of the science behind this, because, again, it's very easy to think of these topics as fantasy, or as an ideology held by hippies plus a few other subgroups in society. But based on all the stigma of the last 70 years, how can we possibly take that seriously, right? Based on all the political messaging that's happened and sort of just say no campaigns and that type of thing. It's a lot of cultural programming that we're trying to overcome at this stage. And thankfully, the research and the facts that are now driving new messaging are starting to have that effect. But what's really happening, and I'll be simplifying this, there's so much more happening.
Thank you.
But there are compounds, including psilocybin, from mushrooms, as well as ketamine, which is a FDA-approved anesthetic, but now being used off-label for depression and anxiety, as well as ibogaine, which is in iboga, which is a tree that grows in Western Africa, in Gabon, with the bark from a tree. There are many others. I won't list them all. One notable one is MDMA, which has been used as a street drug called ecstasy, but it's also now becoming FDA approved. So it's in phase 3 trials to become approved across the country. It's estimated by Biden's administration that within 2 years, MDMA will be administered by legal doctors and clinics, psychiatrists, as a way to overcome PTSD symptoms, which, as we know, is one of the biggest ailments or inflictions on the veteran community. And so there's a great organization called MAPS, which has been pushing that effort forward. And what's happening with many of these is, well, several things. One is that it's reducing the activity in the frontal lobes of the brain. So the
Calming?
Yeah. It's essentially reducing the tendency to think on an intellectual level or thinking on a kind of a rational level, and instead allow I said earlier, the autonomic nervous system and the amygdala and other parts of the brain that are further back to come online. What the second part to that is it's creating neurogenesis. So your brain is actually generating new neurons, and then it's creating synaptogenesis, which is creating more connections between those neurons through the synapses, which are essentially the pathways for information to flow through the brain. Why that's important is because somebody who's experiencing anxiety, depression, there are 300 million people in the world with diagnosed depression. It's the same as the population of America. All those people...
That's pretty sad.
Exactly. PTSD, eating disorders, substance abuse like addiction, and various other indications. And what's generally happening there is that the brain has developed an unhelpful set of thought patterns. And this is because, for example, somebody who's been to war has just been brain trained year after year that when they hear a loud bang, that means they're in danger. So that's creating a synaptic connection that's unhelpful. And what psychedelics are doing, one of the analogies that's used in this industry a lot is that if you imagine a mountain with snow on it, and so imagine you're at the top of the mountain, you're going to ski down there, but there are so many other people who have skied down that mountain that they've created these deep tracks through the powder. And this is a relevant metaphor to use for Colorado. So then when you start to ski down, your skis are going to naturally fall into one of those tracks. You're not going to ski on the fresh powder because these ingrained patterns have already been pre-existing. So those ingrained patterns in this metaphor are like those unhelpful thoughts that have been developed in the brain. And psychedelics are essentially, again, to simplify, they're creating a fresh coating of powder over the whole mountain. So now you have an opportunity for new thought patterns, which can be more helpful, more positive. You can actually unlink the sound of a bang to a feeling of unsafety and instead have that sort of a sense that everything's okay.
I'm stubborn. Could you unlock that?
I would never profess to be your doctor, but I'm happy to I'm always here for helpful resources and sort of pointing in the direction of the best information that I'm aware of out there, whether it's from research or people who've done the experimentation in their own ways to sort of find the clues and figure out what's going on here. And that can be really helpful.
It's really is politics and science. Yeah?
It's many things. It's politics, science, and then also social will. I mean, what's happening in the politics is very much driven by social groups, grassroots initiatives, divisions of, or I should say subsets of society that have had, do you know that in 2010, 30,000 people had self-reported as taking a psychedelic in America alone. And now that number seems to be over 1 million people who have chosen to take a psychedelic, despite the fact that for the most part it's illegal. And so that's just America. Worldwide, that number is orders of magnitude larger. And these people are like me and like my wife, who I've mentioned before has suffered from anxiety and PTSD. And through microdosing of psilocybin, she's been able to have enormous reduction in her symptoms, greater sense of safety, life happiness.
Let's go back to if I did it prior, a couple of years ago. How would I know? Can I eat a whole bag? And based on my experience, I would share that with my friends.
That would be risky. That would be risky.
Yeah.
But
is that what happened?
That is what's happened for millennia in
Yeah.
our species. And, many people have, again, over generations and generations, tried the wrong thing, had some kind of temporary challenges from that. And I even know people who didn't know better, so they took many times more than they really should have or ought to have based on best research.
So that's the stigma.
I think that can be the stigma which traces us back to the lack of transparency, the lack of education that's existed, because under a world of prohibition, everyone was afraid to talk about it. So then how could one person get good information out to the rest of the population? They couldn't. It would be illegal to even talk about it. And that's really what's changing. And so I'll give an example based on the work we do, which my new company, as of 2 years ago, is called Maya Health, and it's a technology platform for legal psychedelic practitioners who are anywhere in the world delivering psychedelics in a legal way. And this can be in a therapeutic context or in a ceremonial context or otherwise. And it allows them to measure what they're doing. Coming next year, we'll be allowing anyone who's actually consuming psychedelics of their own accord, so a lay person who's deciding, usually under legal means, to take a psychedelic, to also use the app to record what happened there, what were the effects, how did they experience a change in their well-being or their health, their family relationships.
You said a lot. I'm going to be able to do it myself?
Eventually, yeah. So in Colorado, in a month from now, there will be a vote for psilocybin and several other psychedelic compounds to be delivered by a practitioner that doesn't need to be an MD or a highly paid doctor or therapist. It can be delivered by somebody more like in a kind of yoga studio type context, where the yoga instructor in this case is a person who's received some training and gotten a license, and then will be able to actually administer these compounds in a safe context, we call it a container or a physical space where the person receiving that is safe.
What kind of license or schooling do you?
Yeah, and this is happening already in Oregon. So there was a ballot initiative that passed in 2019, making Oregon the first state to enact this type of thing. And they're called facilitators. And so they're not called therapists or doctors, they're facilitators. And they'll be operating in what's called service centers, so not clinics or medical labs or anything like that. And this is going to be one of the first major sort of moments in time for someone like you or I to go and receive these compounds legally, which is imminent. It's really coming in the next year or two.
So that person is the facilitator, is going to deem me, judge how much I need?
In a way, they would be trained to do that. And so before you would receive any kind of dosing of anything, you would be asked to fill out a set of questionnaires and potentially do some other tests. And that will change over time depending on technology and what's available. And this would be first to determine whether it would be safe for you. So as I mentioned before, anyone who's had a history of psychosis in their family would generally not be accepted. Anyone who's actively on antidepressants or SSRIs within the previous month would not be accepted for now, because there have been recorded some contraindications there. And all of this is going to allow more information to surface. So there'll be more recording of how individuals are responding to these treatments, and then that information is all being captured on the Maya platform, so that evidence or clinically valid data will then start to be aggregated across the country and across the world by our platform. And it's important to say that's in a very secure, HIPAA compliant, which means sort of medically compliant way. There's no personal information about your name or your phone number or your address being captured. It's really just the sort of information that can tell us about how these compounds are affecting people in conditions like that outside of the academic labs where the research is currently happening, which I'm very excited about.
I had a stroke, and I was tested like for brain mapping. I was asked 3 different times, was I depressed? And I said, why do you keep asking me that? The insurance would pay.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So is there a code word?
The insurance piece is a massive conversation in this space, and primarily because many of the underserved or marginalized demographics in this country are often uninsured. Many times they don't have employer coverage, and they're also, in many cases, to generalize, unable to afford these types of treatments themselves. And the current cost of treatment can be upwards of thousands of dollars, and that will change as more efficiencies come in, but that's still going to leave large swathes of the population without access. And so then we have a situation where the middle to upper class, generally Caucasian demographics, are getting to sort of have access to things that can materially help their lives, help their ability to make further income, to generate well-being in their communities, which will only create more polarization in society, which is not what I think most of us want to see. And so there are some incredible programs being initiated for either nonprofit funding, philanthropic funding for veterans and BIPOC and African American as well as Indigenous communities to gain access. There's also new initiatives on the insurance level, and groups like United Healthcare and Blue Cross Blue Shield are actively researching how to cover treatments
That would
with
be
insurance.
a great success.
It's happening.
The VA and the homeless, if somebody could help those people get it, do you think freeing whatever burdens them would help them advance?
Absolutely. Undoubtedly. The problem with giving a homeless person money is that, again, never to generalize, but in many cases,
Drugs.
the psychology of that person isn't equipped or trained or practiced or really supported to make a long-term investment based on that money. So there's this thing called future discounting, which is one of those biases I mentioned earlier in relation to behavioral economics. And what it means is that people will generally value $5 today versus the $5 if it was only usable by them in 30 days. And so people who aren't kind of equipped or supported or psychologically strengthened to value the money they're given in a month or a year from now are just going to spend it now on the fastest dopamine release, which often is alcohol or a cigarette or another drug or fast food, sugar usually at the best, rather than investing that money, for example, in a nicer shirt so that they can go for an interview or something like that, right? And I think that's where starting with the root cause of somebody's suffering is it's a paradigm that has not been prioritized in the medical or the pharmaceutical world. So many
Why?
Because it doesn't sell.
Oh.
And so pharmaceuticals are one of the largest economy or industries in the world because they are very, very skilled at selling something that people become reliant on. So an antidepressant generally is dampening the negative symptoms of somebody's experience, usually caused by a trauma or childhood adversity or what have you, and so, or a recent breakup or death in the family. That the symptoms of that, which are suffering, are dampened by an antidepressant, but so are the upper sort of regions of emotional experience, meaning that people can generally experience less pain and also less enjoyment, less joy, less sexual libido, less connectedness and love. And so they're left with this sort of middle tier of the human experience, which seems better than the suffering of depression, but it's also not the best we can do. And it's very successful in the pharmaceutical industry because people need to keep going back and buying their prescription to those antidepressants every month. The shortcoming of the psychedelic industry is that 1 up to 3, maybe 6, usually no more than 12 doses of something like psilocybin can leave somebody with a more enhanced improvement to their life than any antidepressant, and sustained over a year, sometimes more. And so that means they're not going back every month to buy more drugs or more medication. They're fine. And the results of, for example,
Okay.
there's lots there as well.
Yeah. After 12 injections,
Usually it's just an oral dose.
my life is changed. I'm all better. I can feel more.
Very, very important point here is that it's usually, like I said, 3 up to 6, up to 8 or 12 doses, which, like I say, are usually through the mouth, so you're not needing to take an injection or anything like that in most cases. And it's accompanied by a sequence of coaching or therapeutic sessions with a trained professional. And that is the biggest difference. So most, if not all, of the research shows that if you just give somebody this dose of something versus if you give them that with a preparatory session and an integration session, which are before and after the dose, at least, then the results are orders of magnitude more successful
Is
with
it
those.
the hesitation? Like, I don't need a shrink, but just give me the mushrooms.
For many people, and again, it comes down to the entrainment in our society that if I can just be given a pill I take twice a day or once every 3 days, then why would I want to go and see a shrink? Or, there's a little bit of resistance in our society to getting help from other people. My father's just turned 70, and this year was the first time he accepted my and other people's suggestion that he see a therapist or a counselor. 70, and I've been asking him to at least
That's a
try
tough
this for 10
age
years.
to make a change.
Better than never. Yeah, and so I'm very proud of him. But that's a sign that, I'm somebody who's deeply, deeply invested and researched in the therapeutic space, and I've been telling him for 10 years about the research and the benefits and the books he can read about it, and he still had that resistance. That's partly a generational thing and partly just a symptom of our society still, but it is changing. There's been a marked shift in the cultural sort of acceptance of things like therapy and coaching and modalities.
In that spirit, the mental health, that's just like a buzzword. Who really knows what mental health is?
The bigger question I have is, why does it matter? I think what we can all agree on is that suffering is unwanted, and joy and love and peace are generally wanted by most people and most times, unless the ego pops up and decides that suffering is better. But that's usually momentary, and it's usually because of a trauma or a fear. And so if you take, for example, the children who are recruited into ISIS in various parts of the Middle East, that's happening not because those children are evil or want to create pain or suffering. Usually it's because they have a fear that they're not going to be accepted, and often that's because they haven't been accepted by the societies they live in or by the world at large. And so what happens when they receive a one-page advert from ISIS saying that if you join our movement or our mission, you're going to get a gun like G.I. Joe, you're going to feel strong and masculine and powerful, you're going to get lovers and people especially when it's boys being recruited, they're being promised these, the sexual adoration of women.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the 72 virgins, they get it. They do die on the sword for this cause. And so what they're doing then is joining a community. They're getting a sense of belonging. And that's no different than somebody joining a certain religion or a cult or a company, for that matter, or a social group. And this desire for belonging is what can overcome the fear of not belonging. And when somebody has that fear of not belonging, they're willing to do whatever it takes to belong. And sometimes that means killing other people, creating harm, creating just verbal abuse to the world around them. And I think that, again, comes down to the root cause of suffering, which psychedelics can meaningfully address. And they're not going to do that for the whole world and for everyone, not even in this country immediately. But we're definitely trending in a direction where, we have a client onboarding from Cambodia. We have people in the Netherlands, Mexico, Costa Rica, Jamaica, all these different parts of the world, as well as in America, that are coming to us saying that they want to use our platform because of their work and their fascination and their passion to help more of the world benefit from these psychedelic medicines.
What is your biggest hurdle in what your goal is?
One of them is that the industry is so nascent and it's so embryonic that there's just a lot to do. And so as a technology company with a very smart team and a little bit of funding, we can do so many different things. So it's really hard to stay focused and to really execute on each step at a time in the order that makes sense. And I don't know if sense is even part of it as much as sort of intuition and listening.
Pick a lane?
Yeah, picking at least a lane at each time. One of my favorite quotes from the author Jamie Wheel is that there's no wrong state, there's just the wrong state for the moment. And so I think that goes to, it goes to psychology again, as well as running a company. But we're doing our best and we have a great team. There has been an enormous boom in funding around 2019 to 2021. And then in the last year, that dried up a bit as well.
Okay. Because of mental health, the influx of money?
Partly. So there are higher recorded numbers of mental health sufferers and diagnoses of mental health than ever before. The pharmaceutical industry is doing less and less to address that. So investors, people that are seeing some of the research show promise in psychedelic medicine, saw an opportunity to make money for themselves, but also to do that while helping the world. And so there was this influx of investor funding as well as just more research. I think in 2018, there were 1, 2, or 3 sort of pharmaceutical companies focusing on psychedelic research. And now there are over 150 or more, and that's just a few years later. So it's that kind of an explosion is happening.
So what is your goal?
I have many goals.
Let's start. Top 3, how about that?
Well, let's start on the sort of work, organizational, mission type level, and that's really to help all of us, or help as many of us as possible, understand more about what's truly going on in the brain as it pertains to our individual social human experiences. Because as Aristotle said, an unexamined life is not worth living. And unless we're really taking the time to investigate and interrogate our own human experience, our psychology, our connectedness, I think there will be more and more suffering in the world, and I would like to avoid that. I would like to help us as a society to grow out of that. And I think the tools that we're creating are meaningfully going to do that in a tangible way. I think possibly more important than that, though, is how I live life each day. And being present, as I'm sure you and many people watching have started to become aware of. Oprah Winfrey did a wonderful job with Eckhart Tolle and his book, A New Earth, which is my favorite book. Highly recommended it. I've read it over 20 times. I think the wisdom in there about the importance of presence and many other topics has really landed for me, and it's a major part of the life philosophy I have, which is if I can be more present, as well as if I'm more present in each moment, especially when I'm with other people, usually I can be more kind, I can listen better, I can care better for them, I can create more joy in the world around me. And that's generated a thesis I have, which is that to some extent I'm creating the world around me. And that can sound, again, quite esoteric. There's sort of spiritual aspects of that. There's also actually physics aspects of that, like the quantum physics of biocentrism. Biocentrism is a great book for anyone interested in that topic, and it says that it's actually recordable on the level of physics that we can actually alter the world around us, and that's because the way we're perceiving the world is actually more important than any kind of physical matter or elements that exist in the world. And so I've had direct experience of this with the help of psychedelics, but I've also had sort of just more contemplation on it in sober states and witnessing it. And so what that means is that if I'm more present and I'm aware or attuned to the fact that I can actually change the world around me through how I'm perceiving it and then how I'm relating back to it. For example, if I were sitting here and I thought that your expression on your face was one of judgment or that you were kind of concerned by what I was saying, I would start to respond in a different way. My whole anatomy and neurophysiology would change in relation to that. And then I would generate probably a feeling of discomfort in you in an interrelated way. Whereas if I perceive you as being a kind and sort of caring person who's interested in what I'm saying and maybe is curious about it, then I'm going to relate back to you and have that sort of the inverse corresponding effect on our relationship. And that, imagine that compounded over all of the relationships we have and how I relate to strangers in the supermarket or the server in the restaurant or my wife or my child. So I know I'm only at number 2 out of 3. Let me. So what that then ties into is how I relate to the people that are closest to me. And one thing I've noticed is that how I relate as the masculine principle in the relationship with my wife is directly generating a sort of, when it's healthy, a very healthy relationship for us. And learning from that, I've then become a different type of father. So the way I am with my 2-year-old toddler, especially when she was a baby, sort of up in the night, dysregulated and screaming, the moments where I let that affect my nervous system and then had me respond to her in a call it unhelpful or dysregulated way would then perpetuate her unhappiness, her fear and discomfort. Whereas when I was able to regulate and stay what we call grounded and centered and actually just be present with her, she would stop crying within sometimes seconds. It was like magic.
We're still on number 2. Correct?
This is number 3.
Oh, okay. So did you start taking mushrooms and learned all this? Or were you born generous with a heart, caring?
My sister gave a speech at my wedding earlier this year. She's 10 years older than me, so she remembers me being a child. And she was very kind to say that I was always that way. And that's not thanks to me. That's thanks to, at the very least, my upbringing and the way my parents and people were in my family, probably also genetic or familial, ancestral thing. But I definitely cultivated it more, and I think it was because of that feedback loop when people would tell me that I was kind as a child or that I was sort of charismatic or that I was helping them, even as adults, see something a new way. That was a positive reinforcement to me, and that made me feel happy. It gave me a serotonin release that then generated me wanting to do that more. And so I was very fortunate. I was very privileged as an individual in my upbringing. And then I think that just naturally led into being more interested in some of these topics. So like I said, in my late teens, early 20s, I started to read about it. I started to become curious about the research, and then that sort of validated some of those initial thoughts. And now it's definitely more of a lived experience, both through psychedelic experiences as well as things like the family dynamics with my wife, my daughter, and other family members and friends.
Can I ask you, and you can share or not share.
Please.
What was your first experience?
So if you consider MDMA to be a psychedelic, that's debatable. MDMA I tried in New York, and it was nice. It was with my ex-partner and two close friends who were a couple, and one of them was introducing my ex and me to this drug. And it was illegal at the time. It was something I was taking a risk to try, but we were together in a way that this friend said, okay, we're going to set an intention now. And for anyone out there who's choosing of their own accord to try a psychedelic, I think one of the most important things I can offer and suggest is setting an intention. And what that means is that before you take it, you come into a state, again, of presence and consider, what do I want to generate from this experience? And so in some cases that might be, I want to nurture self-love, or it might be that I just want to be kinder to this person I'm with. It might be that I want to find laughter and humor. And whatever it is, there's no wrong answer, but by setting that framework, that intention, you're essentially creating an anchor for yourself to that as a root. And so what I've observed from my own experiences and others is that when we don't set intentions, our mind's going into an altered state that can be very unfamiliar. It can often be scary. It can be challenging in many ways. Not necessarily a bad thing. We can get back to that. But when we're in those challenging states, then we can start to get unrooted and start to go in directions where we're acting out or creating, a lot of trauma around the experience to ourselves and others. And that intention can just keep us kind of grounded and anchored to that original idea. And that often is the difference, the night and day, between whether we look back on the experience as a generally positive thing or a generally negative thing.
Do you have to know yourself?
No, I don't think so. I don't think any of us know ourselves. I don't think
Well-
anyone apart from Eckhart Tolle and the Dalai Lama have done enough work to answer that question.
People wear masks and they tell you what they want you to hear or perceive. So to set in intention, is it sincere or, okay, I'm going to make more money?
Making more money is not such a bad thing. Depends how you use the money. Depends how you use the money. So, then the intention isn't I want more money. It's I want to be able to help more people. I want to be able to give my child a better upbringing or education. Those are the differences between a thoughtful intention or an ego-driven intention. And an ego-driven intention might be that I want to look better in front of my friends, so I need a car, I need a Ferrari, right? Ferraris are great if you're somebody that's intrinsically motivated by the feeling of sitting in one and the feeling of driving it and how that feels under your body. But if it's just so that you can have your ego fed by the people looking at you on the street as you drive by, maybe that's not such a helpful thing. So I think it comes down to not necessarily knowing ourselves in completion, but asking several questions that are interrogating more deeply than, again, the surface level aspirations of the ego.
Tell me, I have heard a lot about microdosing. What does that mean?
Great question. Microdosing is going to become very, very popular. It already is. And I see it as being a little further out than the facilitated larger doses, in terms of legalization in this country, but already in other countries it's decriminalized or legal. And so when you take what's called a macrodose of a compound like psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, LSD, these kind of things, you're going to have a very altered state of experience. Again, colors, the way sounds are affecting you, the way that you're seeing other people can be very different than normal. Whereas with a microdose, there's no alteration to your perception or your senses. It can be very, very, very slight, but almost no real alteration. And that's because the dose is smaller, usually about 1/10 of that macrodose. And so that's something that can be, and is by many people, taken before work. And it could be taken in order to have less overwhelm or less stress at work, or it could be taken to enhance creativity or sharp thinking or the way that you're sort of responding to a challenging conversation or a meeting. And again, it's not perceptual, it's sub-perceptual. So you're not really acting in any noticeably different way. You're not seeing the world in any different way.
You're calm?
Calm in many cases, but when you look back on the day reliably, you'll think, wow, that was a great day. And there's a book called A Very Good Day, written by a middle-aged mother, husband, a wife to her husband, and somebody who would never have been considered by her family or friends to ever try psychedelics or any drugs. And her husband was very resistant to this whole idea, but she decided, having suffered from trauma and depression and I think several other sort of symptoms of mental health, and she had tried pharmaceuticals. She'd been prescribed, I think, Adderall or Ritalin or whatever, and had negative side effects and lasting symptoms from that. And so after hearing about microdosing, she decided to try it for 30 days while having her job and her children and everything, and essentially journaled every single day meticulously about the dosing and her experience and how it affected things around her. Again, highly recommended book, A Very Good Day, because it's not coming from some evangelical hippie who's been brought up into the music underworld culture to take drugs. It's really somebody who is skeptical about it, like Michael Pollan, and is then reporting in a very honest and diligent way about her experience. And I've known countless people who, again, were skeptical, very resistant to the idea of drugs, for some reason decided ultimately to try microdosing, overcame. One person told me recently that her anxiety was reduced by about 60% on a daily basis. Wow. Another person with crippling depression from being a veteran, depression symptoms completely relieved, almost completely. And I'm not saying this is a solution, one quick fix for everything or everyone by any means, but certainly worth more open-mindedness than it's had in the last 70 years.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the original question. Where am I going to go to get a microdose?
So I've got to say this in two ways. One, you can't legally do so now.
Okay.
And the other is that there are places
to I'm sure they are.
Yeah, and so I don't make a habit of recommending these places because it's not legal for me to do so, and it's also adding unnecessary risk to the work I'm doing through Maya. But what's happening now, especially in places like Oregon and Colorado, California, by the way, ballot initiatives are being generated in at least 100 other cities around the world, and at least 5 other states I've heard of, like New Jersey and even Utah, which is traditionally seen as more conservative. And so this is happening. More and more, the person you visit for a barbecue over there at their house is going to be able to tell you that she heard that you could get access to psilocybin or LSD or MDMA from this other person, and she can write down their number. And if you're curious enough and you ask enough people, then not only is that generating what I think is a healthy conversation, but it's also likely to yield a contact for you to access these compounds.
And the ultimate health benefits, because stress, anxiety wears on your internal body.
Oh yeah, it wears on your body and your mind and your relationships.
Yeah. So is that one of the benefits?
Very much, yeah.
The nervous system.
Partly, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we live in a world now that for many years has been stressed by the actual construction of our world, the globalization and what that's caused for sort of economic stress factors, to the food system, the supply chain, the way that chemicals and antibiotics and foods are sort of pumped into our bodies, often without us knowing or having that transparency. The lack of access to medicines that truly are designed to just work. So one anecdote I'll give there is that a real person that works at a real pharmaceutical company had been told, after helping to design a pharmaceutical drug that really worked, it relieved symptoms and didn't have any side effects. And he was told by his superiors that we weren't going to push that drug into market. Why? Because then they couldn't sell the other drugs that would help with those side effects. And so they needed to create a version of that drug that had side effects, so they could then sell more of their products. We're living in a world with all of these things, and then we've got wars, and then we've got political unrest and more sort of polarization in political groups than many times before. The world is better than it was historically in many other ways, but it's pretty much inarguable that we have higher levels of anxiety and
more instant
social
gratification.
Unrest. Oh yeah, the call it societal obsessive compulsive disorder, where we need to get a dopamine release, which is it's the neurochemical that creates a happiness response, but it's very short living, which is why we can only look at our screen for 20 seconds before getting distracted by this other screen or by the next sugar fix or nicotine or alcohol, what have you. So there's that, and I think what that's creating is it's not necessarily anxiety on the medical level, but it's like a feeling of anxiety. It's like, what's the next thing that I need to grab onto to be happy for the next 5 seconds? And that is endemic in our society and around the world. And I don't think we've come across anything else that can meaningfully address that beyond what's called a transformational experience. That can be achieved with psychedelics, but also from many other interventions like breath work, like meditation, or like being able to really connect with somebody in a integrous way, things like that. And even the ability to just be in nature for several days or months can achieve this. The ability to see the sunrise and the sunset every day for a period of time can help with these things. And I think unless we, as a society, start to embrace those rather than seeing them as this esoteric, inexplicable or ineffable sort of stigmatized practice, then we're going to continue having the unrest that exists in our society.
Has our brain gotten bigger?
I think so. Well, there were two paths in the ancestral line. So at one point, the early hominid split into Homo sapien, and then one other fork was to the Neanderthal. Neanderthal actually had a bigger brain, but it was formed in a different way, so it didn't have as large of a prefrontal cortex, I think. Sorry if I'm wrong on that to anyone listening. But then the human brain was slightly smaller, but it was able to have better types of executive function and societal or communal functions. And so it isn't necessarily better for the brain to be bigger, but it is the most complex structure known to that we know of in the world or in the universe. It's the most complex, and so that means it's the most is happening within that.
A lot is happening.
Yeah,
it's so interesting. And I heard that these kids and the phones and the computers, that the instant their eyes and brains can't keep up with that. Is that correct?
That's so. There's part of that which is that the brain isn't keeping up with everything around us anyway, so it's not necessarily a damaging thing. I mean, there's so much happening that we're completely oblivious to, and that's fine. There's something called the reducing valve theory, which is that our brains are actually like filters that reduce our awareness of all of the sensory stimuli out there, just so we can manage and cope and focus on the vaguely important things for survival. So that's fine. I think the bigger problem is that media and the way that it's being fed to us, as well as sort of everything from programming to advertising to the sort of just the window dressings down the street and these kind of things, are more and more and more frequent and more dense with information and changing more quickly. So if you notice the rate at which a scene would change in a TV show, like Friends 15 years ago, they would be on the same scene with the same camera angle for sometimes minutes, and now you'd be hard pushed to find a scene in a Netflix show that doesn't change camera angle at least, or at most every 10 or 20 seconds. And the reason is because our brains have become impatient to find new sensory stimuli. And so
what would happen if we went back?
It would be a tough transition because people would stop, whichever shows started to do that would stop getting as much viewership because especially the younger generations need the dopamine release of a new scene more quickly. And so they would get bored and just stop watching that program, which would then kill its funding and kill that. And so basically there's an evolutionary thing that's actually sustaining just to use this one example, TV shows that are changing scenes and camera angles more quickly. And what that's doing is creating recorded levels, historical levels of measurable sort of ADHD, as well as other things. I think one could argue like OCD, but definitely attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which says what it is on the tin, attention deficit. It's literally children being trained to need to pay attention to different things more frequently. It's really sad, and especially as a father of a 2-year-old, we're conscious of that all the time in our home about how we're going to mitigate that risk for her. And so one thing we'll do is to take her to live in Costa Rica for several months, where she'll go to school there and just be in the jungle and not have any TV and things like that can help.
Are you going to let her have a phone?
At some point.
Do you turn your phone off when you go home?
I don't. I think it's something that I could aspire to. I don't do that right now, and there are benefits to that. I'm not somebody who's sitting there.
I don't do that.
Yeah. I wonder about that because I don't think, I think eliminating the ability to have a bad behavior, like looking at your phone too regularly or being distracted from your family to look at your phone, you could reduce that bad behavior in one of a few ways, and one is to just eliminate the phone, to turn it off, to make it impossible. And that's what I think some people need, and probably I need in some cases. And another way is to practice thinking about your phone, but then not actually picking it up.
It's addictive.
Right, and you can train yourself out of addictions. I trained myself out of cigarette addiction of 10 years about 3 years ago now. And that happened with the help of psilocybin mushrooms. It was a single dose, just a single experience that just told me that I didn't need to smoke cigarettes. And so, and there were a bundle of other things going on there as well, but it was quite a short experience actually, and it just taught me that it was possible for me to not need cigarettes. And then after that, it took the work for several months to think of a cigarette, to have the sort of neurochemical desire for it, but to override that with a higher level of, call it sort of cognitive functioning, which was, I don't need it.
And was that your intention when you took it?
It wasn't actually. It wasn't. I've really wondered about that because there are many programs helping people overcome various substance and alcohol addictions with very clear intention setting and making it all about that. But I was fortunate. It was a serendipitous, or, I mean, one thing I had been thinking about quitting for a month or two prior to that. Mm-hmm. So that thought had started becoming consistent in my mind. So maybe during the psilocybin dose, my mind just went back there, and that's the likely hypothesis. But it wasn't necessarily the intention for that specific moment. It felt almost random, or felt like it was happening because it was meant to, as opposed to because I was willing it to. The will then came in the integration process afterwards, because then then I just had the challenge of still neurochemically wanting a cigarette, wanting that fix, and having to override that, which I think is equally important to having the mystical experience of the moment in the psychedelic dose.
The science or the politics? What turns you on more or challenges you more?
Oh, the politics challenges more. I mean, I think the politics are orders of magnitude more challenging to any of us trying to revolutionize this space. Because there's a level of impatience. I mean, those of us who have read the research and had all the conversations to...
And what percent of the population have read that?
Oh, good question. I mean, the industry itself is very well informed, and there are thousands of advocates and actors in the community. And then there are at least hundreds of thousands of others that are active online and going to the sort of the forums and reading the information and the various
Afraid
chatter
to
there.
step over the line?
In many cases. And also, lots of us care about healthier eating, but we don't all make it our profession. So, there's an enthusiasm that's different than full-time dedication of your profession. But it's that I think what's more important than how many people have read the research or are becoming or are somewhat aware of the literature in psychedelic medicine is the velocity of how quickly that's changing. And so that's an exponential curve, an accelerating rate of people becoming switched onto this topic, and many of them turning it into their full-time careers. We get applicants every single week, multiple applicants coming from corporate jobs with much higher pay, with benefits and with various
To study the
trajectories.
brain or study the science of the product?
Yeah, many different parts of it. So in our case, to work on the technology systems that will help the industry to succeed. And then in other cases, they're going to join research organizations or nonprofits or political movements or biotech research. And it's a very, very nuanced and diverse industry already. It's fascinating.
I like the word revolution.
Me too.
You can do it.
Yeah, in this moment in time, I think revolution is needed for...
You are a warrior.
Thank you. I wonder if I'll accept the compliment
Okay,
there.
in your past life, you were.
It's the Scottish blood, A couple of glasses of whiskey and a mission. Try and
Let's
stop
go.
me.
This is so fascinating.
Thank you.
Where would somebody go to learn more, and how can we help you with your project?
I appreciate the question. We are very active on our Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram, but the best single place to go would be mayahealth.com. That's MAYA health.com. And at the bottom there, you'll see our different social links. So they're all in one place. And we really encourage people to be active in our Facebook group and on our online channels with questions. Even if it's a question we can't legally answer, we can generally help at least point you in the right direction in a legal way. And as well as anyone who's interested in this research and the technology, as well as the different initiatives and work that's happening in different countries, we are, as a team, very aware of these things and happy to help point people in the right direction if they want to learn more. And I'll share that I was also co-founder of a nonprofit organization called Unlimited Sciences, unlimitedsciences.org. And this was started in 2018 by two of my partners and myself to fund research in the academic space for psychedelic medicine. And so we're always welcoming any sort of philanthropic contributions to that work.
One funds the other.
They're quite separate at the moment. So the nonprofit funds academic research, whereas our technology company, which is a public benefit corporation, meaning that we're there to create public benefit just as much as profit, and that profit will then be used to create more public benefit. And so that's a PBC, which is a different type of entity.
The whole different language.
and that's quite separate. That's Maya Health.
Well, thank you. I could go on all day, but I think you have other things to do.
I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you.